Canada and Europe have flatly turned their backs on Trump, leading to the loss of trade agreements worth up to $2 trillion US. On top of that, the massive $43 billion contract with Boeing has also been canceled. This is not just a headline shock. It marks the beginning of a global turning point. In just 3 short days, a White House executive order triggered a domino effect. The $43 billion aircraft supply deal was suspended, retaliatory tariff packages were swiftly scheduled, and a $2 trillion hole in global trade began to emerge. This is no longer a warning. It is an economic freefall. While Washington remained bogged down in arguments, Europe decisively walked away from the negotiating table. And Canada, this time Ottawa, is no longer lingering in the background. It has stepped forward as a central player. What is unfolding is not a mere trade quarrel, but a deliberate restructuring of the global order. And the outcome may be crystal clear. The United States risks isolation, abandoned by once close allies, and even being pushed to the margins of the global economic landscape. On May 30th, the U.S. President abruptly declared that negotiations with the European Union had reached a dead end. Just hours later, he signed an order imposing a 50% tariff on all European goods from aluminium and automobiles to electronics and agricultural products. This move sent shockwaves through global financial markets, with European stocks immediately losing more than 2%. A once promising aircraft deal projected to set records now faces the very real prospect of a total freeze worth up to $43 billion. According to Bloomberg estimates, if Europe continues with its countermeasures, U.S. trade losses could surpass $2 trillion U.S. over the next decade. What Washington had touted as its economic trump card is quickly turning into a heavy burden on its own shoulders. Brussels wasted no time hesitating. The European Commission immediately rolled out a second retaliatory package targeting $95 billion U.S. worth of American exports. Yet the quieter, more consequential blow came from another direction. European officials began preparing steps to suspend the massive Boeing agreement. Ryanair, the airline that had placed a $30 billion order for 737 MAX jets, was forced to reconsider its entire purchase plan, particularly as tariffs and extended delivery schedules drove up costs by as much as 14%. In stark contrast, Airbus shares surged more than 3% on the Frankfurt Exchange. And it did not stop there. China's Comarmac unexpectedly entered the discussion. For the first time, European carriers began weighing the possibility of building their fleets without relying on any aircraft carrying an American brand. This is not simply a trade collision. It is a crisis of credibility. Ryanair, already under pressure from supply chain disruptions and weary investors, now faces the risk of losing its foothold in the European market. Should the airline truly pivot to Comarmac, it would mark the first time a European carrier opts for Chinese aircraft over Boeing from the United States. The consequences extend far beyond Boeing's shrinking profits. A more troubling concern is that the global influence of the U.S. Federal Aviation Administration, FAA, may be eroded. For decades, American standards have served as the benchmark for international aviation. But the rise and rapid progress of COMAC could upend this order, fragment regulatory control, and gradually sideline the United States from its leadership role in setting global aviation rules. Airbus may benefit in the short term, but in the long run, the game is changing. A new stage has emerged, one with new competitors and rules entirely different from those of the past. Europe's tariffs are not random. They are carefully targeted at industries that hold symbolic weight in American culture and are particularly sensitive politically. From motorcycles and blue jeans to peanut butter, all staples tied to swing states in U.S. elections, Europe has deliberately struck where it hurts. In 2024, exports of Harley-Davidson motorcycles to Europe plunged by 30%. The company projects losses of roughly $145 million U.S. by the end of the third quarter of 2025. Yet, the damage to U.S. agriculture is far more severe. American agricultural exports to the EU have evaporated by more than $23 billion U.S. The Land O'Lakes Dairy Cooperative in Wisconsin was immediately affected when Europe imposed additional tariffs on butter and cheese. What U.S. officials once touted as a protective policy now exposes the vulnerabilities of their own domestic economy. While Washington busies itself erecting more barriers, Ottawa has chosen a different path. Thanks to the Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement, CTA, Canada, and the EU have virtually eliminated tariffs, creating a smooth trade corridor that Brussels projects could reach $90 billion annually by 2026. With steel and automobile costs soaring in the U.S., European companies are increasingly turning to Canada as an alternative solution. Industrial giants such as Siemens and Alm have shifted supply chains to Quebec and Ontario. Canadian clean tech exports to the EU have surged 41% year over year, boosted by a €1.2 billion hydrogen agreement. Canada, once viewed as merely America's northern neighbor, has now become a strategic trade partner that Europe cannot afford to overlook. The EU Renewable Energy Initiative is now considered a turning point, with Europe aiming to produce 20 million tons of renewable hydrogen annually by 2030, enough to replace nearly $60 billion worth of imported fossil fuels. The Clean Energy Summit between Brussels and Vancouver reached consensus on solar panel standards, AI-powered smart grids, and rare earth supply chains. While Washington cuts back on climate spending, Canada has held firm to the EU's stringent environmental and labor standards. The results are clear. New energy partnerships are being forged. More resilient trade routes are being consolidated. And Europe is sketching out a strategy based on self-sufficiency rather than dependence. If Ryanair truly abandons its Boeing order, the impact will go far beyond lost revenue. It would pave the way for dismantling the firewall that once kept Chinese aircraft from entering Western fleets. Comarmac's potential presence in the European market would not only showcase China's technological capacity, but also weaken the FAA's authority in dictating global standards. Airbus still dominates in Europe, but a single major contract for Comac would signal a fundamental shift in the very structure of aviation certification. The issue is no longer just about who builds planes, but about who sets the rules of the skies. And if Washington loses that role, it will be exceedingly difficult to reclaim. Meanwhile, Brussels is scaling up the CCTA model worldwide. Since 2023, the EU has launched 17 bilateral trade negotiations across Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. The new agreements provide duty-free access in exchange for cooperation on digital standards, labor linkages, and infrastructure investment. In 2024 alone, the EU signed a USD 3.4 billion supply chain agreement with India, an arrangement entirely outside the U.S. system and one that bypasses the U.S. dollar as a payment mechanism. These are not knee-jerk reactions. They are systematic moves designed to gradually replace the set of rules on operations, dispute resolution, and international trade that the United States has held for decades. Europe's retaliatory measures are no longer confined to paper. The $95 billion tariff package is set to be rolled out by mid-July. The European Commission has stated clearly, if Washington does not change course, these tariffs will be imposed. While the U.S. scrambles to cool tensions, Brussels has opted for decisive action. Markets reacted instantly. Airbus shares rose another 3.7%. Steel exports from Canada to the EU jumped 24% in just the first quarter. 7 new trade agreements between Ottawa and Brussels are also being fast-tracked. Notably, in all these discussions, the United States is completely absent. What is happening is not merely a fracture within Western trade. It is a process of reconfiguration. And this time, the United States is being left out. The world is not standing still, and Europe is not asking anyone's permission. Some former EU leaders even describe this moment not as a crisis but as a turning point. The potential losses facing Boeing, the rise of Comarmac, Canada's growing advantage, and a series of new trade corridors all point to the same reality. The balance of power is shifting from a single tariff order. A wave of agreements, realignments, and decisions is emerging, powerful enough to shape the next era of global trade. Washington once believed tariffs would force partners back to the negotiating table. The reality has been the opposite. Tariffs have triggered a restructuring process. And now, as $2 trillion worth of trade opportunities steadily evaporates, the bigger question remains: who will write the new rulebook for the global economy? What is unfolding is not noisy diplomacy, but a quiet yet weighty realignment. While Washington is still mired in tariff disputes, Brussels is already working to establish new standards, rewrite the rules of trade, and gradually reshape the entire global logistics sector. Importantly, this process is not unfolding in chaos. It is happening in an orderly fashion. Every new agreement signed, every shipment rerouted, every contract suspended is part of a pre-calculated plan. Europe is not threatening to decouple from the United States. It is actively doing so. The pathways of global supply chains are shifting. Trade is now intertwined with digital infrastructure, while mechanisms for dispute resolution are gradually shifting their center of gravity from the West to the North. The United States may anticipate resistance, but what it is witnessing instead is incremental replacement. For decades, America's strength lay in its ability to create stability. But today, that leverage has become a liability because stability is no longer guaranteed. As Europe diversifies its network of partners and standardizes a new trade framework with Canada, India, and the Gulf states, reliance on the U.S. system is increasingly seen as a burden rather than an asset. Washington's policy of weaponizing tariffs has inadvertently pushed allies to pursue alternatives that bypass the United States entirely. The effects may not be immediate, but in the long run, the outcome will be America's strategic isolation. On the very playing field it once dominated. This shift is not merely economic. It carries a geopolitical dimension by linking trade to agreements on digital standards, the environment, and technology. Europe is transforming supply chains into a network of strategic alliances. Countries that once relied on American technological infrastructure are now signing agreements with the EU covering frameworks on artificial intelligence regulation, data security standards, and rare earth cooperation. These are not just trade contracts. They are new corridors of influence. While Washington remains preoccupied with short-term trade gains, Europe is laying the groundwork for long-term integration where systems can operate seamlessly together and regional states grow increasingly interdependent, all without U.S. consent or participation. The impact of this shift is already evident in American industry, and Boeing is only the beginning. U.S. agriculture, automotive manufacturing, and technology are under mounting pressure as traditional partners seek alternative suppliers. Zero tariff access to the European market, once considered a strategic advantage, has now disappeared, steadily eroding America's market share. Even with promises of protection, domestic firms face an unavoidable reality: shrinking global demand, rising production costs, and spreading uncertainty. What was once called economic security has now become a driver of vulnerability. The world as trade order is being redrawn, and the transatlantic axis is no longer the center of the global economy. A new structure is taking shape, a trade triangle linking Europe with emerging economies in Asia and the Middle East. Flows of energy, data, logistics, and supply chains are being rerouted in new directions. The United States once believed tariff pressure would force Europe back to the negotiating table, but that calculation has proven wrong. In reality, rather than reinforcing old relationships, these policies have accelerated the birth of new alliances. With every agreement signed without Washington, the shift becomes more entrenched. Europe is not only holding its ground, it is actively reshaping it. The priorities of the next industrial era are clear: clean hydrogen, battery technology, digital infrastructure, and semiconductor manufacturing. The EU is coordinating strategically using multilateral agreements to strengthen ties with global partners beyond the United States. Long-standing dependence on American aerospace, agriculture, and arbitration mechanisms is being systematically dismantled. Every new contract signed under this approach aims to reduce risks stemming from Washington's instability. This is not just an economic safeguard, it is a quiet transformation in how Europe redeems its own economic sovereignty. What once seemed like a minor policy dispute has become a structural shift. The 50% tariff Washington imposed intended to force adjustment has instead acted as a catalyst for watershed decisions. Ryanair may abandon its Boeing orders. Europe may source agricultural products from Latin America. Clean tech investment is flowing into Canadian companies, and semiconductor cooperation is gradually shifting toward India. Taken together, this is not just a reshuffling of trade flows. It is a comprehensive reordering of priorities, partners, and principles. In trying to strengthen its position, the United States has ignited a chain reaction that could permanently alter its role in global trade. This is not unfolding as a noisy crisis, but as a calculated fracture. No grand speeches are needed to declare it, nor any formal treaty to close the old chapter. Yet, by looking at trade flows, contract terms, new shipping routes, and policy frameworks now in place, the conclusion is clear. The transatlantic bond has lost its traditional pull. In its place, a more multipolar dispersed network is emerging, where Europe signs agreements without American intervention, where Canada rises as a continental trade bridge, and where global influence is sustained through cooperative mechanisms rather than unilateral pressure. The era in which the United States naturally assumed the role of leader in global trade has ended, not with a sudden crash, but through countless small shifts that have accumulated over time. Europe no longer has the patience to wait for Washington to change course. It is writing its own path. Canada is not standing behind to fill a void. We are stepping forward, and China no longer needs to knock on the door because it is already inside the room. The age of tariffs, once thought to be a tool to expand U.S. power, may in fact deliver the opposite result. Not a stronger position, but a quiet retreat. A retreat that shifts the United States from rulemaker to rule-taker, forced to read from a playbook drafted elsewhere. In Washington, there is still a belief that trade relations, no matter how strained, can quickly be restored. But markets function differently once contracts have been rewritten, once new infrastructure is put in place, or once standards are harmonized with other partners. The path back to the old order narrows. Europe is not merely reacting to temporary decisions from the White House. It is preparing for the steps ahead. What may look reversible in theory has in practice been cemented by long-term agreements, regulatory reforms, and the rerouting of supply chains away from the U.S. orbit. This is not a short-term adjustment. It is a permanent withdrawal.
The U.S.-EU relationship once endured for decades thanks to shared history and parallel interests. But today, Europe's new direction is driven less by loyalty and more by the pursuit of leverage. The concept of industrial sovereignty is gradually shaping Europe's economic strategy, prioritizing production within the bloc, building independent supply chains, and expanding multidimensional trade networks. Brussels no longer waits for a seat at Washington's table. Instead, it is designing its own future driven by urgent necessity rather than nostalgia. The transatlantic alliance may still matter in security and diplomacy, but in trade, the separation has begun quietly, steadily, and with little chance of reversal. The looming collapse of the Boeing-Ryanair deal is not just a business risk. It is symbolic, showing that even industries once seen as America's pride can be easily shaken when global trust falters. Boeing, once the dominant aircraft supplier in Europe, is now viewed as a source of instability. The cause lies not in technology or product quality, but in policy. If a giant aerospace company like Boeing can be replaced so quickly, what would prevent other sectors from sharing the same fate? Losing a contract is costly enough, but losing trust is far more expensive and exponentially harder to recover. What Europe is pursuing is not retaliation against the United States, but replacement. When Washington's tariffs caused disruption, Brussels immediately sought alternatives. Agricultural products from Latin America, steel from Canada, electronics from China, semiconductors from India. These are not improvised measures, but a systematically designed structure. The goal is not to punish the United States, but to eliminate the instability it creates. Each new agreement, each alternative supply source secured, is a step toward autonomy and long-term stability. What Washington views as a temporary reaction, Europe regards as a fundamental reconstruction. The technology trade agreement between Canada and the EU has now become a model. Zero tariffs, adherence to labor standards, combined commitments on climate and digital policy. Its success has given Brussels the confidence to replicate it globally. From Nairobi to New Delhi, many current trade negotiations are using this very framework as their foundation. This approach allows Europe to build a network of stable and reliable partners based on predictability and legal clarity. Qualities absent from America's erratic trade policy. The issue is not about excluding the United States, but about freeing Europe from dependency on it. The rise of Mac is clear proof its emergence has nothing to do with propaganda or political slogans, but with timing. With Boeing in trouble and Airbus at full capacity, Mac has become the third option Europe can seriously consider. If Ryanair signs a deal for Chinese aircraft, the shockwaves will go beyond economics. It would mark the first time the soft monopoly of Western aviation is visibly breached. From there, FAA standards would no longer hold the status of global benchmark. China's certification process would begin to exist in parallel and compete hidden. A scenario, once dismissed as far-fetched, is steadily becoming reality, sparked by nothing more than an overly aggressive tariff policy. While Europe concentrates on building new agreements to secure stability, Washington continues to cling to a punitive mindset. The U.S. assumption is simple. Use economic pressure to pull allies back to the negotiating table. In practice, the outcome has been the opposite. Partners are not returning. They are walking away entirely. This is the blind spot in America's worldview. It believes economic leverage alone is enough to ensure loyalty. But in a world full of choices, leverage without stability becomes the very reason partners leave. Washington's silenced in the face of shifting agreements, rotating alliances, and a reshaped market is not strategic wisdom, but resignation born of a lack of vision. Over time, that silence is losing its value and becoming a sign of structural fatigue. In the 21st century, national power is not measured solely in military might or GDP. It is expressed in who can write the standards for climate, digital technology, clean energy, and global trade. Europe is confidently stepping into that role. Canada is moving in tandem. China is pushing to place itself in the game, and the United States, from whence being the author of international rules, is reduced to passively reading the new frameworks built without it. This does not mean the end of American power, but it may mark the close of the era in which the United States held an unquestioned leadership role in trade. The world continues to move forward, only now the axis of movement is increasingly circling around the U.S. rather than through it. As Ryanair's Chinese aircraft, as Europe redirects its farm imports toward Brazil, and as clean hydrogen projects channel investment into Canada, a new economic map is being drawn. Not through confrontation, but through construction. Not through grand declarations, but through the numbers and contracts and spreadsheets. Behind every redrawn trade route lies a simple truth. The global economy no longer waits for a green light from Washington. Tariffs are no longer the tool of pressure the United States had hoped for. They have become a ticket for allies to seek opportunities elsewhere. What began as a political decision has now turned into a geopolitical turning point. A new path is opening on a scale larger than ever before. $2 trillion has not disappeared. It has been redirected. Contracts have changed hands. Capital flows have been reassigned. Alliances have been What America calls strategy, the rest of the world sees as instability, and for that reason, others have chosen to act. The question now is no longer whether this is a trade war or just a temporary clash. The real issue is whether the United States is excluding itself from the future of global trade. Who will lead and who will simply watch as the new rules are being written? The EU is shifting course, and the signal is reverberating worldwide. From Southeast Asia to South America, countries are realizing that access to major markets no longer means passing through Washington. As Brussels expands infrastructure and digital agreements, many nations are lining up to join, not only to trade, but to share an alternative set of rules and values. The 50% tariff is not merely a blow to steel or automobiles. It has become a turning point, confirming long-standing fears. The U.S. is no longer a reliable partner. This time, there are no safeguards. Contracts can vanish overnight, and policy can reverse at any moment. In response, nations are accelerating. The EU's strategy is clear: to create a trade network with multiple supply routes, multiple suppliers, and flexible mechanisms. Japan, Vietnam, and many emerging economies are being woven into this blueprint. The objective is to ensure that no one, not even the United States, can disrupt Europe's supply chains. And the result? America has shifted from pillar to variable. Partners now sign contracts on the assumption that Washington will remain unstable. Preventive costs rise, contingency clauses expand, and jurisdiction steadily drifts away from the U.S. In a world full of risks, conditional trust is the loudest warning signal. While the United States is bogged down in tariffs, the EU is quietly leveraging the power of predictability and stability for long-term investors. This is the decisive factor. That is why Europe, along with Canada and other global partners, is becoming the more sustainable choice. International trade is not collapsing. It is gradually replacing itself. Power no longer rests with the loudest actor, but with the one who provides certainty. And today, that is no longer Washington, but Brussels with Canada, playing an increasingly pivotal role.